It's best to ink or paint your background fabric before you begin your fabric collage. That way the ink has plenty of time to dry before you're ready to fuse your applique. Before inking your background fabric, you will need to protect your work surface. You can use a plastic tablecloth, but I prefer using freezer paper to the back side of your background fabric. The freezer paper adds stability to the fabric so that it doesn't stretch or warp as much while you are tracing the pattern. The freezer paper also makes your work portable. With the freezer paper behind your background fabric, you can pick it up and move it around if necessary without worrying about anything underneath it getting inked up. If possible, it's best to fuse the freezer paper to your background fabric before you trace the pattern onto it. Before you fuse the freezer paper to your background fabric, however, make sure you're going to be able to see the lines of your pattern through the layers of your background fabric and the freezer paper. To test this out, put a piece of freezer paper behind your background fabric and then put both of them on top of your light source and just check to make sure you can see the black lines of the pattern clearly through both layers. If you can't see the lines clearly, you still have quite a few options. It's possible that your background fabric is too heavy or dark, so you could consider using a lighter background fabric, or a brighter light source could be helpful. Or another option is just forego fusing the freezer paper to your fabric and use a tablecloth instead. Or you could trace the pattern onto your background fabric first and then fuse the freezer paper to the back. There's one more trick that I know of, and I didn't include this in the pattern because I felt like it was a step that might not be necessary and that it would possibly require you to buy one more thing. But I'm going to talk about it here so that you are aware of this as an option if this is something you would like to do. So what you can do is get a large piece of clear vinyl. It needs to be larger than the entire design on the March Hare quilt, so it needs to cover all of the quote and then the entire picture below that. It would need to be roughly 25 by 40 inches. But what you would do is once you have that large piece of clear vinyl, just lay the vinyl over the top of your pattern and using a Sharpie, just trace the entire design onto the vinyl. Lay the vinyl between your light source and between your background fabric and the freezer paper, assuming that you've fused on the freezer paper. Then once you've done that, you can see the lines of the pattern much more clearly since the vinyl is clear and it allows a lot of more light to pass through. Well, I highly recommend this technique. If you want to try it out, you would just need to go and buy some clear vinyl. And if you are having trouble seeing through even just the one layer of your background fabric, I recommend that you go to this extra step. You'll have much less frustration. Once you have determined whether you're going to fuse your freezer paper to the back of your background fabric, you're going to follow these directions. You will probably need 2 pieces of freezer paper to cover the back of your background fabric. Most freezer paper is not wide enough to cover the entire back. Both pieces will need to be about an inch longer than your background, so 45 inches long. You'll start out with one piece. I'll put my background fabric down on my ironing surface with the right side of my background fabric facing down and the wrong side facing up. I line up my freezer paper so that there's about an inch of it sticking out to either side and about an inch of it sticking out up at the top of my background fabric. To fuse it down, first of all, make sure that the waxy side of the freezer paper is facing down toward your fabric. You don't want to get all that wax onto your iron once you start ironing, and that's what makes the freezer paper fuse to the background fabric. Start at the center of the wax paper. Slowly move your iron. Keep it in each area for 2 to 5 seconds to heat up the wax paper and allow that wax to melt. And as you're working from the center to the outside edges of your fabric, watch for any bubbles, and if you see any, gently work them out towards the edges with your iron iron, just kind of pushing the bubbles out toward the edges. When you've fused your first piece, take your second piece and line it up so that it butts up right against the edges of your first piece of freezer paper. You don't want it to overlap, just line up neatly. When you've done that, fuse it to your background fabric in the same way that you fused the first piece. Your second piece probably will be more than you need to cover the rest of your background fabric, so go ahead and trim off the extra about an inch outside the edge of your background fabric. Once you've got both pieces of freezer paper fused down, press your background fabric from the front. That's just going to help ensure you really get a good bond between your freezer paper and the background fabric. And then when you've done that, just give everything a chance to cool down before you start tracing your pattern onto the background fabric.